Behind the locked doors of Studio 5150, there are hundreds of tapes no one has ever heard. Alex, Eddie's brother, once said, maybe enough to make a few albums. Wolfgang was more guarded. Not all of it is ready to be shared. Since the day he passed, one question has lingered. Is this an unopened treasure? Or fragments Eddie never wanted the world to see? A man who lived his life through sound, leaving silence as his final legacy. The paradox is painful. Eddie Van Halen once astonished the world with fingers moving faster than fireworks, turning the electric guitar into an icon. Yet in his last moments, he left only a whisper, "I love you," and a locked room. What really lies behind that door? And could it hold Eddie Van Halen's last word? Stay with me as we trace the unfinished trail he left behind. Chapter 1. 12-year-old whiskey, the beginning of a genius. A ticket to America was paid with music. But Eddie's ticket to the stage began with a sip of whiskey. At 12 years old, the brown-skinned boy from Pasadena learned to calm his nerves before an audience with the liquor his father handed him. From then on, every time the lights came up, there was the faint click of a bottle cap in the dark. A guitar prodigy, or a quiet ritual that would carry him further than he ever imagined. In 1962, the Van Halen family left Holland after 9 days at sea. They arrived in California with $15 and a second-hand piano. Their father, Jan, played music on the ship in exchange for the passage. Once on land, the four of them shared one cramped room with two other families. Eddie was 7, Alex was 9. They spoke no English and carried the features of their mixed Asian heritage. At school, blonde children mocked their skin color and halting accents. One classmate later recalled, he was like a shadow, always with his head down. At first, the brothers studied classical piano. Then one day, Eddie heard Alex practice drums. Alex was better. They switched places. Alex on drums, Eddie on guitar. A small trade that changed the course of their lives. From then on, the guitar never left Eddie's hands. He practiced until his fingers bled. The smell of iodine and bandages lingered inside the case. One string left a permanent red mark. When the house grew quiet, there was only the sound of fingernails tapping wood. Tick, tick, like a clock. Backyard parties and dingy bars became their first stages. Some nights, their band Mammoth played 5 sets in a row. They printed flyers themselves, stuffing them into lockers, pulling in one listener at a time. In the dim yellow light, Eddie exploded with energy. A friend remembered. On stage, he was someone else. Confident, powerful, nothing like the boy you saw off stage. But when the applause faded, Eddie packed up his guitar and slipped into the shadows. No small talk, no mingling, just a quiet walk home with Alex. On stage, he was a leader. Off stage, he was a shadow. The two selves never stood side by side. There was one detail few mention. Before each performance, their father would press a sip of liquor into Eddie's hand. Drink it. It'll calm you down. That tiny ritual became indispensable. Years later, Eddie admitted, I needed alcohol to get on stage. A habit born at 12 that followed him for life. Music pulled Eddie out of the margins of the crowd, but the price was that he never dared to let go of his guitar. It saved him, even as it imprisoned him. And before every show, he always checked 2 things, the strings on his guitar and the bottle in his pocket. One day, when the hands began to shake, but the bottle was still needed, who was keeping time for whom? Chapter 2. The stage lights, the studio shadows. In 1978, Van Halen's debut album was released. With just a few minutes of the solo, Eruption, Eddie sent shockwaves through the guitar world. The press called him the Jimi Hendrix of a new generation. Fans stood frozen, asking themselves, how could those fingers create that sound? Success came too fast. But right behind the bright stage lights, Eddie felt trapped. David Lee Roth, the band's lead singer, wanted Van Halen to become a showbiz act. Flashy, theatrical, full of tricks. Eddie cared only about the music. He hated the idea of putting on a circus. The tension soon became routine. In the studio, Roth and the record label pushed the band to record more covers. Eddie was frustrated. To him, the band was being turned into a jukebox. One engineer recalled Eddie saying many times, "I don't want to spend my life playing other people's songs." One night, after everyone had gone home, Eddie slipped into the studio at 4 a.m. He quietly erased his earlier guitar parts and replaced them with new ones. The engineer watched as the young man hunched over a Marshall amp, a half-burned cigarette resting on the neck of his guitar. He worked alone, in absolute silence, he remembered. This wasn't just creativity anymore. It was a battle. Eddie wanted control of every note. Maybe it came from fear, that if others made the choices, he would once again become the boy left on the margins. In 1982, the album Diver Down was released. More than half the songs were covers. Eddie was so disheartened, he built his own studio at home and named it 5150. In that private space, he wanted freedom, to experiment without limits. And it was there, sitting at a keyboard, that he created the melody for Jump. Jump became a #1 hit on the Billboard charts. But to Roth, it was betrayal. A rock band leaning on keyboards? The arguments exploded. On stage, the fire still burned, but backstage, the air was ice cold. A crew member recalled, sometimes they wouldn't speak to each other for weeks. Amid the band's dazzling success, Eddie grew more isolated. He found freedom only in that locked room, surrounded by wires, amplifiers, and bottles. No one interfered anymore, but no one stayed with him either. An old friend remembered, when you walked into 5150, you saw piles of cassette tapes stacked high, empty bottles scattered around, and Eddie alone staring at his guitar. It was like he was building a kingdom, but with only one citizen. Eddie once said, "I don't care about fame. I just want to hear the music in my head come to life." But the question lingers. In that obsession, did he end up building his own prison? On stage, Van Halen was a storm. But inside the studio, it was a battlefield. And in that battlefield, Eddie slowly became not only the musician, but also the engineer and the jailer of himself. So was this war simply about controlling the music? Or was it Eddie's way of holding on to himself before everything slipped away? Chapter 3. A golden marriage turns into a locked room. In 1981, Eddie Van Halen married Valerie Bertinelli, the familiar face from American television. The media called them the Golden Couple. A rock star at the top of his career, and a beautiful young actress. Picture perfect. The wedding was filled with laughter. Everyone thought it was a real-life fairy tale. In the early years, their home was full of joy. In 1991, their son, Wolfgang, was born. Valerie later recalled, "We had the happiest moments of our lives sitting around the dinner table, just being a normal family." But inside the house, cracks began to show. Eddie slipped deeper into alcohol and drugs. He often disappeared into Studio 5150 for hours, leaving his wife and child alone. Valerie wrote in her memoir, "I loved him, but sometimes I felt like he had vanished into another world." One small but haunting detail. Valerie often found scraps of paper with strange phone numbers in Eddie's pockets. When she asked, he just shook his head and walked back into the studio, closing the door. A close friend said Valerie once had to drive Eddie to the hospital after a night of heavy drinking. Yet the next morning, he still went on stage, smiling brightly for the crowd. Between love and music, Eddie often chose the guitar. Late at night, Valerie would walk downstairs and see the light spilling from under the studio door. She'd peek in, Eddie hunched over, cigarette in one hand, the other hand moving across the keys. On the table sat a half-finished glass of liquor. The scene repeated like a ritual. There's a story that Valerie once wrote a letter to her best friend. "I know he loves me, but I can't reach him. The guitar and the drinking have taken the man I married." The letter was never sent, left behind as a sad testimony. It was during this period that Eddie also began having affairs. The press only hinted, but those in the industry spoke more openly. Eddie was not faithful. Valerie endured years of turmoil before finally deciding to separate. Wolfgang, still a little boy, often saw his father passed out in the living room. He would tug on his mother's sleeve and ask why Dad was sleeping in the chair. Those moments became part of the family's memory, etched in quietly painful detail. To the outside world, Eddie was still an idol. But in his own kitchen, Valerie faced the empty bottles and the sound of a studio door shutting tight. Loneliness lived at the center of what had once seemed like a perfect marriage. Eddie was not heartless. He admitted to friends that he hated making Valerie sad, but couldn't stop. Music and addiction had become twin chains, pulling him away from his family. One friend described it this way: Eddie lived two lives, one as a husband and father, and one as a ghost locked inside the studio. And the question is, was Valerie's love ever strong enough to save him? Or had Eddie never allowed anyone to enter his true world from the very beginning? Chapter 4. A reunion tour that turned into a public tragedy. In 2004, Van Halen announced a reunion tour with Sammy Hagar. Fans were excited. They hoped to see their old idol again, those fiery leaps, those explosive solos that once shook entire stadiums. But when the lights came up, the image before them was nothing like what they remembered. Eddie stepped onto the stage thin, disheveled, with most of his teeth gone. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. He staggered with his guitar as if he needed it just to stay standing. One fan recalled, "I couldn't believe that was Eddie Van Halen. He looked like a shadow of himself." The sound came, but it was no longer sharp. Eddie missed notes, lost rhythm. Instead of an eruption, the hall sank into uneasy silence. Some fans quietly walked out halfway through the show. Sammy Hagar, his old bandmate, later shared his shock. When he visited Eddie's home, he found that the once famous 5150 studio looked like an abandoned shack. Empty bottles everywhere, guitar strings scattered across the floor. Eddie collapsed among the wreckage. "I didn't recognize the man in front of me anymore," Hagar said. A member of the tour crew remembered Eddie sitting alone in the dressing room, whispering to himself. Sometimes he would mumble for an hour, then suddenly laugh out loud. Many blamed the drugs and alcohol. Others thought it was sheer loneliness, Eddie slipping into a place where no one could reach him. There was one scene people repeated often. During rehearsal, Eddie suddenly stopped playing, threw a bottle on the ground, and screamed, "Why won't you all just leave me alone?" Then, as if nothing had happened, he picked up the guitar and launched into another solo. These eruptions left both his bandmates and the crew shaken. The audience only saw a few minutes of chaos on stage, but for those close to him, it was the story of an artist unraveling, a once brilliant self torn apart by alcohol and illness. One friend recalled how Eddie often disappeared after a show. They would find him passed out in his car, clutching his guitar as if someone might take it away. The sight unsettled everyone. People asked why Eddie agreed to go on stage in such a state. Was it financial pressure? Or fear of letting fans see that he had already fallen? No one knew for sure. But everyone knew this. 2004 became a painful milestone. A once invincible icon stood fragile and broken under thousands of eyes. In a short interview, Eddie once wrote, "I don't play guitar for fame. I play to survive." But when even the guitar could no longer save him, what was left to hold on to? How could a man who created immortal melodies fail to keep himself standing before his own audience? Chapter 5. Cancer and an explanation. No one believed. At the end of the 1990s, doctors diagnosed Eddie Van Halen with tongue cancer. The news struck like lightning. He was forced to have part of his tongue removed. After the surgery, Eddie still walked on stage, smiling, playing as if nothing had changed. But behind the scenes, the wound tormented him every hour. Doctors urged him, "If you want to live, you must quit smoking." Eddie nodded politely, but then lit another cigarette right in the hospital room. When friends asked why, his answer was strange. "Cigarettes aren't the reason. I believe it's the metal picks I hold in my mouth while playing. They absorb electromagnetic waves in the studio." That explanation confused many. Doctors quickly dismissed it, saying there was no scientific evidence that metal caused cancer. But Eddie insisted. On the Howard Stern show in 2006, he even said firmly, It's like playing guitar in the middle of a thunderstorm. I know what caused it. One detail made the story even stranger. Eddie kept hundreds of copper and brass picks, many worn down by bite marks. He carried them like charms, always holding one in his mouth during practice. A friend recalled, he believed if he gave up that habit, he would lose his inspiration to play. But was it just blind faith, a way to avoid facing the truth? A self-consolation that the disease had nothing to do with decades of smoking and drinking? While the public celebrated him, Eddie fought the illness in silence. He traveled to Germany to try new treatments. For a time, his health improved, and the press reported he was cancer-free. But only a few years later, the disease returned, stronger than before. Eddie kept most of the pain hidden. He still appeared, still smiled, still played, but his body grew frail. His son Wolfgang recalled, "Some days Dad was so weak he could hardly speak, but he still went into the studio and sat there alone for hours." Fans never saw the reality behind the curtain. To them, Eddie was a fighter. To those close to him, he was a man in decline. Valerie, his ex-wife, often pleaded, "You have to quit smoking." Eddie only shook his head and gave a faint smile. Inside Studio 5150, surrounded by cassette tapes, amplifiers, tangled wires, and thick smoke, Eddie worked tirelessly. It seemed he believed that very room both harmed him and kept him alive. The question lingers. Did he truly die from cancer, or from a misplaced belief in metal picks? Or was the illness only a curtain hiding the larger truth, that Eddie never escaped the very habits that had once helped him survive on stage? Chapter 6. The Final Whisper and the Unopened Treasure. In 2017, Eddie Van Halen was told by doctors he had only a few weeks left to live. But he refused to accept that verdict. He flew to Germany to try an experimental radiation treatment, and somehow he managed to stretch those weeks into 3 more years. Those 3 years weren't exactly a rebirth, but they were a pause. He still played, still stepped into the studio, still smiled with his son. Family members said Eddie never lost his mischievous spirit, even as his body grew weaker. Then, in early 2020, the pandemic shut down travel. Eddie could no longer return to Germany. His health declined rapidly, bouts of pneumonia, and then a stroke that nearly stole his voice. A close friend remembered. He still held the guitar, plucked a few shaky notes, and gave a sad smile, as if to say, "I'm still here." Wolfgang, his son, never forgot that sight. Dad went into Studio 5150 and played the old tapes. Some days, he just sat for hours, saying nothing, only listening to himself. For Wolfgang, that studio was more than a place to record. It was a vault of memories, a shelter where his father held on to himself note by note. There were whispers that Eddie once hoped to give a secret performance, a final farewell to the fans. But it never happened. His health wouldn't allow it, and behind-the-scenes tensions left the plan unfinished. All that remained were the unreleased tapes. Alex, his brother, once said, "Maybe enough to make a few albums." But those reels still sit locked inside the 5150 vault, waiting for the day someone decides to open them. On October 6, 2020, the California hospital room was silent. His family gathered: Wolfgang, Alex, Valerie, and Janie. Eddie's breath grew faint. His last whispered words were, "I love you." Then his eyes closed. The official cause was listed as a stroke after years of battling cancer. Yet some doctors pointed to pneumonia as the real reason. And for the public, one truth seemed even clearer. The years of self-destruction had always been the silent killer. His final image was not that of an immortal rock star, but of a frail man clutching his guitar as if holding on to his soul. And one question still lingers. Eddie left with his family's love. But did he also take with him a part of the music the world will never hear? Epilogue, an immortal legacy, an unanswered question. Eddie Van Halen changed the electric guitar forever. Before him, the solo was just an accent. After him, it became the centerpiece. One listened to Eruption, and thousands of young boys rushed to the music store. The tapping technique and the brown sound became the inheritance of an entire generation. But looking back, we see more than a genius. We see an immigrant boy mocked in school, a man who learned to rely on alcohol at 12, a husband who lost his marriage inside the walls of a studio, and a star who stepped on stage in 2004 looking like the shadow of his former self. These contradictions made him less of a perfect icon and more of a real man, scarred, vulnerable. Perhaps it was that very fragility that made him feel close to us. Everyone carries their own darkness. Eddie just lived with his under the glare of millions. Yet one thing still hangs unresolved: the 5150 vault. Inside lie hundreds of unreleased tapes. Alex said, "Enough for a few albums?" Wolfgang hesitated. Not all of it is ready to be shared. Are they unfinished drafts? Or Eddie's unspoken farewell? His death left many questions. Did he die from cancer? From pneumonia? Or from the years of self-destruction? Did he truly believe the metal picks were to blame instead of cigarettes? Or was that just a way to avoid facing the truth? On October 6th, 2020, Eddie whispered, "I love you," and closed his eyes. What we don't know, and may never know, is this. In that final moment, what music was still playing in his mind? Maybe just a few unfinished notes. Maybe the quiet tapping of a boy long ago, clutching his guitar to hide from mocking stares. Eddie Van Halen left behind a towering legacy, but he also left behind an emptiness that can never fully be filled. And the final question for all of us is this: did the genius leave us completely drained? Or is there still a part of his music, a part of his truth, locked forever behind the doors of 5150?